Why was she on her knees, picking up scattered pencils while storm sirens screamed outside? Clara Morrison's hands moved with steady precision, gathering her clipboard, her pencils, her dignity. The concrete floor was cold beneath her knees, but her breathing stayed even, controlled, like she'd been shoved before, like this wasn't the first time someone had dismissed her as nothing. "Get the hell out of my way." Those words still hung in the air. Lieutenant Commander Jake Stevens stood over her, all 6 feet 2 inches of muscle and arrogance, his SEAL uniform stretched tight across his chest. His blue eyes burned with the kind of impatience that came from men who believed their time was more valuable than anyone else's. The warehouse at Naval Air Station Pensacola buzzed with chaos. Hurricane Miranda was bearing down on the Florida coast. Category 5. Winds already hitting 60 miles per hour outside. Palm trees bent at impossible angles. Debris tumbled across the airfield like toys thrown by an angry child. But Stevens wasn't thinking about the storm. He was thinking about the woman crouched on the floor, the supply clerk who had somehow inserted herself into his operation. The coffee lady, that's what he'd called her. What does the coffee lady think she's doing here? Clara rose slowly. Her black-rimmed glasses sat crooked on her face from the shove. She adjusted them with one hand. Her brown hair, pulled into a practical bun, had loosened slightly. Strands fell across her forehead. She was 42 years old. Her logistics polo shirt was soaked with 12 hours of sweat. She looked tired, ordinary, forgettable, the kind of person who blended into the background of military installations. The kind of person real warriors walked past without a second glance. Supply clerk. The words came from Petty Officer Marcus Mitchell, seated at the communications desk. His voice cut through the warehouse with particular cruelty, the kind that came from men who enjoyed watching others suffer. Real warriors need access now. You don't belong here. The SEAL team erupted in harsh laughter. 4 men, all elite, all trained to survive the world's most demanding military operations. Their phones were already out, recording. This was entertainment. This middle-aged logistics coordinator who thought she belonged in their command center. This was going to be good footage. But Clara's face remained calm, unsettlingly calm. She met Stephen's eyes with the kind of steadiness that came from facing worse storms than Hurricane Miranda. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She brushed dust from her knees with methodical precision, like she had all the time in the world. Frequency 2840, 7.5 megahertz. The words cut through the laughter like a blade. Her Midwest accent was steady, clear, no hesitation, no doubt. Iranian submarine emergency band, active in 7 minutes. Stephen staggered backward. His confidence cracked. Just for a second, what did you just say? In 18 minutes, Clara continued. You'll understand why this supply clerk is standing in your command center. The warehouse fell silent. Outside, the storm sirens wailed. Their mechanical screams mixed with the howl of wind against metal doors. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across stacked supply crates. The air tasted of salt spray and diesel fuel, thick with the electric tension that preceded major storms. 15 personnel scrambled through evacuation preparations, their movements urgent but practiced. Stevens wiped sweat from his shaved head. Around him, SEAL Team Alpha represented the elite of naval special warfare, each man carrying himself with the unconscious arrogance that came from surviving Hell Week, from completing missions that existed only in classified files. They had spent the morning loading sensitive equipment, their movements precise and confident, until this middle-aged woman had somehow inserted herself into their world. Iranian frequencies. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams stepped forward. His massive frame blocked the overhead lighting. Tank, as his teammates called him, served as base security and took personal offense to civilians who overstepped their boundaries. Lady, you're talking about classified information. That's need-to-know material, and supply clerks definitely don't need to know. Clara picked up her clipboard. checking items with the same methodical attention she'd shown before the confrontation. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor as she moved between radio stations. But there was something in her posture, feet shoulder-width apart, weight distributed evenly, something that made Master Chief Thompson pause his inventory duties across the warehouse. Thompson had 30 years of naval experience etched into his weathered face. He'd seen enough specialists to recognize when someone's movements didn't match their job description. The way Clara checked equipment wasn't random civilian fumbling. Every adjustment was purposeful, economical, efficient, like muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions under pressure. Emergency communications protocol requires frequency sweeps every 15 minutes during HERCON1, Clara said, without looking up from her checklist. Her fingers moved across the radio controls with surprising precision, making minute adjustments that somehow sharpened the static-filled reception. Chief Warrant Officer David Chen glanced up from his secure terminal. Chen prided himself on being the smartest person in most rooms, his MIT education and top-secret clearance setting him apart from ordinary military personnel. He'd been monitoring weather reports and threat assessments when this supply coordinator started spouting technical specifications that shouldn't exist in civilian vocabulary. HERCON protocols are restricted access, Chen said, his voice sharp with authority. Logistics personnel receive basic emergency training, not operational communications procedures. The warehouse's massive doors groaned against wind gusts. Outside, debris tumbled past windows. Hurricane Miranda was still 8 hours from landfall, but her outer bands carried enough force to remind everyone why they were evacuating inland facilities. Stevens checked his watch. 14:30 hours. His patience was evaporating. His team had critical equipment to secure before the storm surge reached their current elevation. They didn't have time for power games with delusional civilians. "Listen carefully, coffee lady," he said, moving close enough that Clara had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "This is a military installation during emergency operations. You're interfering with real soldiers doing real work. Find somewhere else to play office manager." Clara's response was to continue her equipment checks, but something in her movements made Thompson abandon his supply manifest. The way she held herself under verbal assault reminded him of operators he'd served with in Iraq. That particular stillness that came from knowing you could handle whatever came next. A sharp electronic beep cut through the warehouse noise. The emergency radio Clara had been adjusting suddenly crackled to life, with clear reception where there had been only static moments before. The improvement was dramatic enough that everyone within 20 feet turned to stare. Radio propagation improves when antenna alignment compensates for atmospheric disturbance, Clara said, her tone neutral as if she were reading a grocery list. Ionospheric reflection patterns shift during severe weather. Basic physics. Mitchell laughed from his communication station, but the sound carried a nervous edge. Basic physics, right? I've got 3 years of advanced communications training, and I couldn't clear that signal. Maybe you should have paid better attention during atmospheric science classes, Clara replied without malice, adjusting another frequency dial. The second radio began receiving clear transmissions from the National Weather Service, eliminating the static that had plagued communications all morning. Chen stood up from his terminal, intelligence analyst instincts triggering alerts he couldn't quite identify. Something about Clara's casual technical competence felt wrong. Not incorrect, but mismatched. Supply coordinators didn't optimize radio equipment with the confidence of communications specialists. They especially didn't reference Iranian submarine frequencies with the specificity of someone who'd encountered them personally. "Where exactly did you learn about Iranian naval communications?" Chen asked, his analytical mind already running through security protocols and clearance violations. Clara looked up from her checklist. met his eyes with that same unsettling calm, the kind of calm that came from people who'd seen things, done things, survived things that left marks you couldn't see on the surface. "I read the manuals," she said simply. Her voice carried no defensiveness, no pride, just statement of fact. "The manuals are classified," Chen pressed. "Logistics personnel don't have access to submarine frequency databases." "Then maybe someone left them in the supply office by mistake," Clara replied, returning her attention to the radio equipment. Her dismissal was so complete, so casual, that it felt like a slap across Chen's MIT-educated face. Stevens felt his anger building. This woman was making fools of them, making them look incompetent in front of junior personnel, making them question themselves when they should be focused on evacuation procedures. But Thompson was watching Clara with different eyes, seeing past the logistics polo shirt and worn sneakers, seeing the way she moved, the way she held herself, the way her hands worked the equipment with the kind of confidence that came from years of specialized training, not weekend seminars and emergency briefings. And then the emergency radio sparked to life again. But this time, it wasn't the National Weather Service. This time, it was something else entirely. A frequency most people in that warehouse didn't even know existed. A frequency that made Chen's face go pale, made Stephen's confidence finally crack wide open. Because Clara Morrison had just intercepted an Iranian submarine communication. Live. In real time. During a Category 5 hurricane. And she'd done it with equipment that wasn't supposed to be capable of long-range interception. Done it with adjustments that shouldn't have worked. Done it with the kind of precision that came from people who'd spent years hunting submarines in waters most civilians never knew existed. The voice on the radio spoke in Farsi, fast, urgent, technical. And Clara Morrison stood there in her soaked polo shirt and worn sneakers, listening to that voice, with the kind of focused intensity that made every SEAL in that warehouse suddenly realize they'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. Because whatever Clara Morrison was, she wasn't a supply clerk. Not really. Not the way they understood supply clerks. She was something else entirely. Something they hadn't seen coming. Something that was about to turn their entire world upside down. The storm outside was nothing compared to what was about to happen inside that warehouse. Because in 7 minutes, everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman they just humiliated was going to shatter like glass. And they were going to learn a lesson they'd never forget. What made a 42-year-old logistics coordinator freeze an entire SEAL team with 7 words? Clara's hand hovered over the radio dial, not moving, not adjusting, just hovering there while the Farsi transmission crackled through speakers that shouldn't have been capable of receiving it. The warehouse had gone silent except for that voice. That urgent, technical voice speaking coordinates and depths and operational timelines that made Chen's analytical mind race through threat assessment protocols he'd memorized at MIT. Stevens watched her face, watched the way her eyes tracked information, the way her lips moved slightly, forming words in a language she supposedly shouldn't understand, the way her entire posture had shifted from defensive civilian to something else, something that made his SEAL training suddenly whisper warnings he'd been too arrogant to hear before. "They're repositioning," Clara said quietly. Her voice had changed. The Midwest accent was still there, but underneath it was something harder, something forged in places where people didn't come home. 3 vessels, heading northeast toward shipping lanes off the Strait of Hormuz. Chen's hands were already moving across his keyboard, pulling up threat databases, running scenarios, but his fingers faltered when he realized what Clara had just done, what she'd just revealed. Because intercepting Iranian submarine communications required more than just good equipment and lucky frequency sweeps. It required knowledge of encryption patterns, communication windows, operational procedures that existed in classified databases even MIT graduates weren't cleared to access. "How do you know that?" Chen's voice came out sharper than he intended. How do you know they're repositioning? How do you know there are 3 vessels? How do you even know that's a submarine communication and not coastal defense chatter? Clara turned to face him. Her black-rimmed glasses caught the emergency lighting. For a moment, Chen saw something flicker behind her eyes, something that looked like calculation, like she was deciding how much to reveal, how much to keep hidden, how much truth these men could handle. "Because I've heard that transmission protocol before," she said simply. Her hand dropped from the radio, fell to her side with the kind of practiced stillness that came from people who'd learned not to make unnecessary movements in hostile territory. "I've heard it in the Persian Gulf at 0300, when Iranian Kilo-class submarines thought they were operating in secure waters. I've heard it off the coast of Bahrain when they were testing new equipment. I've heard it enough times to recognize the communication pattern, even when atmospheric distortion from a Category 5 hurricane should make it impossible to intercept." The warehouse had become a cathedral of stunned silence. Mitchell's hand had frozen over his keyboard. William stood motionless, his massive frame casting shadows that suddenly seemed less intimidating than they had 5 minutes ago. The other SEAL team members had lowered their phones. The entertainment footage they'd been recording had transformed into something else, something that made them uncomfortable, something that made them question every assumption they'd built their confidence on. Stevens felt his world tilting, felt the ground beneath his combat boots becoming uncertain. He'd spent years building his reputation, surviving training that broke most men, completing missions that existed only in redacted files. He was supposed to be elite, supposed to be the best, supposed to be the one other people looked up to with respect and maybe a little fear. But this woman, this 42-year-old supply clerk with brown hair and worn sneakers, this woman was looking at him with something that wasn't respect or fear, something that was closer to patience, like she was waiting for him to catch up, like she'd been here before, like she'd stood in rooms full of elite operators who thought they were the best, and she'd quietly known better. Thompson moved closer. His weathered face showed recognition now, the kind that came from connecting dots, from seeing past surface appearances, from remembering classified briefings and operational legends that lived in whispers and rumors. "Viper," Thompson said quietly. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. His eyes were locked on Clara's face, searching for confirmation, searching for truth. "You're Viper 7. The name hit Stevens like a physical blow. Viper 7. He'd heard that call sign in classified briefings, heard it whispered in secure facilities by officers who'd worked submarine interdiction in the early 2000s, heard it mentioned with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients and operational legend who'd shaped modern warfare doctrine. But Viper 7 was supposed to be retired, gone, disappeared into civilian life after completing operations that had redefined submarine tracking protocols. Viper 7 was supposed to be someone else, someone larger than life, someone who matched the legend, not this middle-aged woman in a logistics polo shirt who looked like she should be coordinating supply orders and scheduling equipment maintenance. Clara's face remained neutral, but something shifted in her eyes, something that acknowledged Thompson's recognition without confirming or denying it, something that said this conversation was moving in directions she'd hoped to avoid. "I'm a logistics coordinator," she said calmly. "I coordinate supplies. I schedule equipment maintenance. I file paperwork. That's what my job description says." But that wasn't what Thompson heard. He heard the careful parsing of words, the distinction between what her job description said and what she actually was. He heard the same kind of precise language he'd heard from operators who'd worked in spaces where official records didn't match operational reality. Chen was already pulling up personnel files, his fingers flying across the keyboard with the kind of desperate speed that came from needing answers, needing to understand how badly he'd miscalculated, how completely he'd missed something that should have been obvious to someone with his intelligence and training. Clara Morrison, born 1984 in Des Moines, Iowa, enlisted Navy 2002, served as. Chen's voice trailed off as he reached the classified sections. The parts of her file that required clearances he'd thought he had but suddenly realized might not be enough. The parts that showed gaps. Years where her service record became redacted text and authorization codes that suggested operations existing in shadows deeper than normal military hierarchies. Stevens felt shame creeping up his spine, hot and acidic. He'd shoved her, called her coffee lady, dismissed her as nothing, and she'd stood there, taken it, gathered her pencils with steady hands while his team laughed and recorded. "Why didn't you say something?" Stevens' voice came out rougher than he intended. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Clara adjusted her glasses. That same methodical movement she'd made after he'd shoved her. Would it have mattered? She asked quietly. Would you have listened? Or would you have assumed I was lying? Assumed some middle-aged woman in a polo shirt couldn't possibly be who she claimed to be? The question hung in the air like smoke. Stevens had no answer, because she was right. He wouldn't have believed her, would have laughed harder, would have told her that operational legends didn't look like tired logistics coordinators with brown hair and worn sneakers. The radio crackled again. Another burst of Farsi, faster this time, more urgent. Clara turned back to the equipment, her hands moving across controls with the kind of practiced precision that came from years of hunting submarines in hostile waters. "They're accelerating their timeline," she said, her voice shifting into operational mode. Something clinical, something that existed outside normal emotion, something that scared Stevens more than any enemy combatant he'd faced in combat zones. They've detected weather disruption affecting satellite coverage. They're using the hurricane as cover to reposition assets while our intelligence infrastructure is degraded. "How long do we have?" Thompson's question came automatically. Years of operational experience taking over. Years of trusting people who showed competence regardless of what their polo shirts said. 16 minutes until they reach optimal positioning, Clara replied without hesitation. 23 minutes until regional command can scramble response assets. 7-minute gap where they'll be operating in waters we can't effectively monitor. Chen was on his secure phone now, speaking quickly to someone higher up the chain, speaking with the kind of urgent professionalism that came from recognizing you were in over your head. That came from understanding you needed people who knew more than you did, people who'd seen things you'd only read about in classified briefings. Mitchell had abandoned his cruel smirk. His face showed something closer to confusion, to shame, to the uncomfortable realization that he'd been recording his own humiliation rather than someone else's. William stood silent, his massive frame somehow diminished, like he'd been inflated with arrogance and someone had let the air out, like he was seeing himself for the first time through honest eyes and didn't like what he saw. Stevens moved closer to Clara, not threatening this time, not dismissive, just closer, close enough to see the lines around her eyes, the marks left by years of squinting through periscope displays and analyzing sonar signatures in hostile waters, close enough to see the scars on her hands, small ones, barely visible, the kind that came from working equipment in confined spaces where every movement mattered. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The words felt inadequate, pathetic, like offering a band-aid for a gunshot wound. "I'm sorry for shoving you, for calling you coffee lady, for assuming you were nothing." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. Her brown eyes were calm, patient, like she'd heard apologies before from men who'd dismissed her, like she'd learned not to hold on to anger because it served no purpose in the work she did. "You're not sorry yet," she said softly, "but you will be. Because in 13 minutes, you're going to understand exactly how badly you misjudged this situation, how badly you misjudged me, and that understanding is going to stay with you for the rest of your career." The storm outside intensified. Wind rattled the massive warehouse doors. Emergency lighting flickered. Somewhere in the distance, Transformers exploded as power grids failed under hurricane-force winds. But inside that warehouse, a different kind of storm was building, one that had nothing to do with weather patterns and everything to do with recognition, with shame, with the slow, painful realization that elite operators weren't always the most dangerous people in the room, that legends didn't always look legendary, that the woman they dismissed as nothing was actually everything they'd trained to become but never quite reached. Because Clara Morrison wasn't just Viper 7. She wasn't just an operational legend who'd shaped submarine interdiction doctrine. She was something more fundamental than that. She was proof that strength didn't need to announce itself, that competence didn't require recognition, that the most dangerous people in the world often looked exactly like the people you'd walk past without a second glance. And Stevens was beginning to understand that the lesson she was about to teach them wouldn't come from anything she said. It would come from what she did next, from watching her work, from seeing operational excellence performed by someone who'd been dismissed as coffee lady. The education was about to begin, and it was going to hurt in ways that had nothing to do with physical pain. It was going to hurt in the places where men built their identities, where they constructed their sense of worth, where they told themselves stories about who they were and what made them special. Clara Morrison was about to deconstruct those stories, quietly, efficiently, with the same methodical precision she'd used to gather her scattered pencils from the cold concrete floor. What happens when a legend stops hiding? Clara's hands moved across the communications console with the kind of fluid precision that made Stevens' breath catch. This wasn't someone who'd learned these procedures from manuals. This was someone who'd lived them, breathed them, perfected them in waters where mistakes meant death and hesitation meant disaster. She pulled up frequencies Stevens didn't know existed, made connections between satellite feeds and atmospheric data that showed operational thinking decades beyond standard protocols. Every movement was economical, purposeful, like watching a master musician play an instrument they'd spent their entire life perfecting. Thompson stood beside her now, no longer pretending to do inventory, no longer pretending he didn't see what everyone else had missed. His weathered face showed something between respect and regret. Respect for who she was, regret for not seeing it sooner, for not speaking up when Stevens had shoved her, for not defending someone who'd served in places that made his Iraq deployment look tame. "They're using burst transmission protocol," Clara said, her eyes tracking data streams that scrolled across multiple monitors. Short duration, high encryption. They learned this after the 2019 incident in the Gulf of Oman. They learned it because someone taught them their old methods were vulnerable. Someone meaning you. Chen's voice was quiet now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. He'd read enough of her file to understand he was dealing with someone whose operations had shaped how adversarial nations thought about submarine warfare. Clara didn't answer directly. Her attention was fixed on the screens, on the pattern recognition that came from years of hunting submarines through waters that hid more secrets than anyone wanted to admit. "Get me Commander Harris at Regional Command," she said to Mitchell. Her voice carried quiet authority now, the kind that didn't need rank or title to enforce compliance. Mitchell moved immediately. No snide remarks, no cruel observations, just professional response to someone who clearly knew more than he did. Stevens watched her work and felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been building since he'd shoved her, since he'd called her coffee lady, since he'd assumed this tired-looking woman with brown hair and worn sneakers was beneath his notice. The crack felt like failure, like missing something so fundamental that it called into question everything he thought he understood about reading people and assessing threats. The call connected. Commander Harris's face appeared on the secure video feed. His expression was tense. The hurricane was disrupting operations across the entire southeast. He didn't have time for routine communications check-ins. "Commander, this is Morrison at Pensacola," Clara said before anyone else could speak. We have Iranian submarine activity using the hurricane as cover. 3 vessels repositioning toward Hormuz shipping lanes. They'll reach optimal positioning in 11 minutes. Harris's expression shifted. The tension transformed into something sharper, more focused. Morrison. His eyes searched the screen, trying to match the name with a face, then finding it, recognition hitting like lightning. "Viper, is that you?" Sir, Clara said simply. The confirmation was understated. No drama, no flourish, just acknowledgement. Harris leaned closer to his camera. His face showed a mixture of surprise and something that looked like relief. "What the hell are you doing working logistics in Pensacola?" "Retirement, sir. Turns out I'm not good at sitting still." Harris barked a laugh, sharp and genuine. "Retirement, right. Because legends like you actually retire." He shook his head, then his expression turned serious. "What do you need?" Clara outlined the situation with the kind of crisp efficiency that came from operational briefings in crisis situations. She spoke in precise terms, technical specifications, tactical implications, no wasted words, no unnecessary details, just the information required to make command decisions. Stevens listened and felt his education continuing. This was how real professionals communicated. This was what operational excellence looked like when it wasn't performing for an audience, when it was just doing the work that needed doing. "Can you confirm the vessel's signatures?" Harris asked, his fingers already moving across his own terminal, already mobilizing response assets, already treating Clara's assessment as gospel because he'd worked with her before, because he knew what her capabilities meant. Clara pulled up analysis data, enhanced through algorithms Stevens didn't recognize, processed through methods that suggested years of development in classified programs. The signatures matched known Iranian kilo-class patterns, but with modifications that indicated upgraded propulsion systems and quieting technology. "They've improved since 2019, Clara said. "Someone's been helping them, probably Russian advisory teams. The signatures show acoustic dampening that wasn't in their capability profile 18 months ago." Harris nodded. His face was grim. "Can you track them through the weather disruption?" Clara was already adjusting parameters, compensating for atmospheric interference, running calculations that involved ocean temperature layers and salinity gradients and factors Stevens had never considered relevant to submarine tracking. "Yes, sir, but we need to move fast. Once they reach position, they'll go quiet. Could be weeks before we get another clear reading." Stevens felt Williams move closer. The massive SEAL who'd been so dismissive earlier was watching Clara work with the kind of focused attention reserved for learning from masters. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like hunger, the hunger to understand, to learn, to become better. "Commander," Clara continued, "I can maintain tracking through the next phase, but I need authorization to access SOSUS array feeds and satellite thermal imaging that's usually restricted to active operations personnel." Harris didn't hesitate. "You're active again as of now. Consider yourself temporarily recalled to duty under emergency provisions. I'll have the paperwork filed within the hour. Whatever you need, Morrison, whatever assets, you're cleared." Clara's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her posture, like a weight had lifted, or maybe like a weight had returned. The weight of responsibility, the weight of capabilities that couldn't be ignored when they were needed, the weight of being who she actually was instead of hiding behind polo shirts and worn sneakers. "Sir," she said simply, then turned back to her console, her hands already moving with renewed purpose. Harris looked past Clara to Stevens. His expression hardened. "Who's the SEAL commander on site?" Stevens felt his throat tighten. "Sir, Lieutenant Commander Jake Stevens." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Stevens, you're going to provide Morrison with whatever support she requires. You're going to treat her with the respect due to someone who's forgotten more about submarine operations than you've learned in your entire career. And you're going to thank whatever deity you pray to that she's professional enough not to let your earlier behavior compromise this operation. Am I clear? Crystal, sir. Stephen's voice was steady, but shame burned hot in his chest, because Harris knew. Somehow Harris knew what had happened. Maybe Thompson had sent a message. Maybe Chen had reported it, or maybe it was just obvious from context, from the way Clara had positioned herself, from the tension in the room. Harris's face softened slightly. Morrison is one of the best we've ever had. Learn from her, watch her work, and maybe you'll understand what operational excellence actually looks like. Harris out. The screen went dark. The warehouse settled into working silence. Clara was fully absorbed in her tracking protocols, building a real-time picture of submarine movements that should have been impossible to construct with degraded satellite coverage and hurricane interference. Mitchell was feeding her data from his communication systems. No commentary, no resistance, just professional support. Williams had pulled up reference materials, trying to understand the technical processes he was witnessing. Chen was coordinating with intelligence assets, his MIT education finally serving its actual purpose instead of just inflating his ego. And Stephen stood there, watching it all, feeling the full weight of his failure. Because this wasn't just about misjudging one person. This was about revealing flaws in his own character, blind spots in his perception, arrogance that had made him cruel, that had made him enjoy humiliating someone he'd perceived as lesser. Thompson appeared beside him. The Master Chief's voice was quiet, meant only for Stephen's ears. She could have pulled rank the moment you touched her, could have ended your career with a phone call. Instead, she picked up her pencils and kept working. That's class, Commander. That's the kind of professionalism that separates legends from everyone else. Stevens nodded, unable to speak, unable to express the complicated mixture of shame and admiration and determination that was churning through his gut. On her console, Clara's tracking showed the Iranian submarines moving into position. 9 minutes until they reached optimal placement. 9 minutes to coordinate response assets. 9 minutes to prevent a strategic development that could have implications for global shipping and regional security. Clara worked with calm focus. No stress in her movements. No panic in her voice when she updated Harris on position changes. This was someone who'd done this before. Someone who'd operated in situations where lives hung on split-second decisions and technical precision. The storm outside intensified. Hurricane Miranda's outer bands were giving way to the main body of the storm, wind speeds increasing, pressure dropping. The warehouse shuddered under the onslaught. But inside that space, Clara Morrison was building something Stevens had only read about in classified after-action reports. She was building a complete operational picture from fragments, creating clarity from chaos, turning atmospheric interference and equipment limitations into opportunities through methods that existed at the intersection of technical mastery and operational intuition. Stevens moved closer, not to supervise, not to command, just to watch, to learn, to understand what excellence looked like when it operated outside the spotlight, when it worked in logistics polo shirts and worn sneakers because that's what circumstances required. Clara glanced at him just for a second, her brown eyes calm behind her black-rimmed glasses. No anger, no resentment, just acknowledgement that he was there, that he was learning, that maybe the lesson she was teaching would stick. And Stevens understood something fundamental, something that would reshape how he thought about leadership and respect, and the assumptions that could make even elite operators blind to reality. True strength didn't announce itself. It didn't need recognition or rank or combat uniforms to be real. True strength looked exactly like Clara Morrison. Quiet, competent, unshakable, working the problem while everyone else was still trying to figure out what the problem actually was. The education was continuing. and Stevens was finally ready to learn. How does someone who's been invisible become impossible to ignore? 6 minutes until the Iranian submarines reached optimal positioning. Clara's fingers danced across controls while her eyes tracked 3 different data streams simultaneously. The warehouse had transformed from chaotic evacuation site into an impromptu operations center, and at the heart of it was a woman who 20 minutes ago had been dismissed as coffee lady. Stevens positioned himself where he could observe without interfering. He'd learned that much at least, learned to recognize when his presence added no value, when the best thing he could do was stay out of the way and watch someone who actually knew what they were doing. Mitchell was feeding communications data with the kind of focused professionalism that came from recognizing his earlier behavior had been childish, cruel, the kind of thing that seemed clever until you realized you'd been mocking someone whose capabilities exceeded your comprehension. His fingers moved quickly across his keyboard, pulling feeds from sources Clara requested, routing data streams that required clearances he hadn't known existed. "They're slowing down," Clara said quietly. Her voice carried across the warehouse with the authority of certain knowledge. "They've detected something, probably our response assets mobilizing." Chen looked up from his intelligence terminal. His face showed concentration, respect. The arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by genuine curiosity about how Clara was extracting information from data that looked like noise to everyone else. "How can you tell? The signature resolution isn't clear enough for speed assessment." Clara pointed to subtle variations in the acoustic pattern scrolling across her primary monitor. The harmonic shifts in the low-frequency band. When submarines reduce speed, their signature changes. Not in obvious ways, but if you've spent enough time listening, you learn to recognize the patterns. Like hearing someone's mood in their voice even when they're not saying anything specific. "How many hours have you spent listening?" William's question was genuine, no challenge in it. Just curiosity from someone trying to understand expertise that exceeded his own experience. Clara's hands continued moving, making micro-adjustments to the tracking algorithms, compensating for atmospheric interference that was getting worse as the hurricane's main body approached. "Enough hours that I stopped counting. Enough submarines that I started recognizing specific vessels by their acoustic signature. Enough close calls that I learned to trust patterns other people dismissed as noise." Thompson was coordinating with Harris's command center, relaying Clara's updates with the kind of precise communication that came from understanding how critical timing was, how lives and strategic outcomes hung on accurate information delivered clearly. 4 minutes until optimal positioning, he announced. "Response assets are scrambling, but won't reach interdiction range for 11 minutes. Clara nodded. Her expression remained calm, but Stevens could see calculation happening behind her eyes, could see her running scenarios, assessing options, making the kind of tactical decisions that existed in spaces where official command structures didn't reach. "We need to make them think we're tracking them more accurately than we are," Clara said. Her voice shifted into operational mode, clinical, detached from emotion. "We need to make them nervous enough to abort positioning but not so threatened that they go fully defensive." How do you make a submarine nervous? Mitchell's question revealed the gaps in his training, the limitations of communication specialists who'd never actually hunted submarines in hostile waters. Clara's fingers moved across different controls now, accessing systems that required authorization Stevens didn't fully understand. You make them hear things. You use their own paranoia against them. You broadcast in frequencies they monitor but can't quite decode. You create uncertainty. Make them question whether they're being actively tracked or just paranoid. Make them choose between completing their mission and preserving their operational security. She pulled up transmission protocols Stevens had never seen, started generating signals that looked random but carried patterns Clara assured them would be interpreted as threat indicators by Iranian submarine commanders who'd been trained to recognize American tracking methodologies. "This is psychological warfare against an enemy you can't see," Clara explained while she worked. "This is making them understand that continuing their mission means risking exposure, means potentially compromising assets their command considers more valuable than this specific operation." Stevens watched the transmission go out, watched Clara's face as she monitored Iranian communication frequencies for response. She was gambling, using her understanding of adversary psychology to influence decisions happening hundreds of miles away in submarines she could barely track through hurricane interference. 2 minutes until optimal positioning, Thompson announced. His voice was tense but controlled. Clara adjusted her headphones, listening to frequencies that carried whispers of activity most people would miss. "Come on," she muttered quietly. "Make the smart choice. Recognize you're exposed. Abort the mission." The warehouse held its breath. Emergency lighting cast Clara's face in harsh relief. Outside, Hurricane Miranda was demolishing the Florida coast. Inside, a different kind of storm was reaching its climax. The storm of capabilities meeting necessity, of a hidden legend forced into the light because circumstances demanded it. Chen's terminal showed encrypted Iranian communications increasing, burst transmissions happening faster, more frequently. "They're talking to command," he said, his analytical mind processing implications. "They're reporting something." Clara listened, her expression unreadable. Then something shifted, a subtle relaxation in her shoulders, a slight exhale that suggested relief. "They're aborting," she said quietly. "They've been ordered to abort positioning and return to deeper waters. They're interpreting our signals as evidence of active tracking that threatens their operational security." Harris's voice came through the secure channel. "Morrison confirmed status. Are they withdrawing?" "Confirmed, sir," Clara replied. 3 vessels reversing course. They're prioritizing preservation over mission completion. We've successfully disrupted their positioning without requiring direct military confrontation." "Outstanding work," Harris said, and Stevens could hear genuine admiration in the commander's voice. "Absolutely outstanding. Stand by for debrief protocols." The warehouse erupted in collective exhale. The tension that had been building released in small gestures. Mitchell slumped in his chair. Williams shook his head in what looked like disbelief. Chen removed his glasses and cleaned them with trembling hands. But Clara just continued working, tracking the submarine retreat, documenting their course changes, building the intelligence picture that would inform future operations. Because for her, this wasn't a dramatic victory. This was just work. This was what she did, what she'd always done, even when people called her coffee lady and assumed she was nothing. Stevens approached slowly, respectfully, the way you approach someone who just demonstrated capabilities that existed in different category than anything you'd achieved. "Clara." She looked up from her console. Her brown eyes were tired now, the adrenaline fatting, the weight of what she just prevented starting to register. "I owe you an apology," Stevens said. "A real one, not the inadequate words from earlier. I owe you recognition that what I did was worse than unprofessional. It was degrading. It was cruel. And it revealed failures in my character that I need to address." Clara studied his face, searching for sincerity, searching for understanding that went deeper than just words prompted by embarrassment. "You know what bothers me most," she said quietly. "It's not that you shoved me, not that you called me coffee lady. It's that you enjoyed it, that your team laughed and recorded it, that humiliating someone you perceived as lesser made you feel powerful." Stevens felt shame burn through him, because she was right. He had enjoyed it, had felt that surge of dominance that came from putting someone in their place, had reveled in the laughter of his team, had been performing cruelty for an audience. "I did," he admitted, "and I can't take that back. Can't undo the video they recorded. Can't erase the memory of you on your knees picking up pencils while we laughed. All I can do is acknowledge it was wrong, commit to being better, and learn from someone who demonstrated more professionalism in 15 minutes than I've shown in my entire career." Clara's expression softened slightly. "That's a start," she said. "That's more honest than most people manage." Thompson joined them, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that came from recognizing shared experience, shared sacrifice. "Viper," he said simply, "it's an honor, a real honor." Clara smiled, tired but genuine. "Master Chief, the honor is mutual, and please call me Clara. Viper 7 was a different time, different operations, different version of myself." The hurricane outside was reaching its peak intensity. The warehouse shuddered under sustained winds that exceeded anything the building was rated to withstand. Emergency protocols were being implemented, evacuation orders being finalized. But for this moment in this space, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with storms or submarines or operational success. Something about recognition, about seeing people for who they actually were instead of who you assumed them to be. About understanding that excellence wore many disguises, and the most dangerous assumption was thinking you could identify it at a glance. Clara Morrison returned to her console, started finalizing reports that would be classified at levels most people in that warehouse would never access, started documenting operations that officially never happened, started preparing to disappear back into logistics polo shirts and worn sneakers. But Stevens understood she would never be invisible again. Not to him, not to anyone who'd witnessed this. Because once you'd seen what real excellence looked like, you couldn't unsee it, couldn't go back to making assumptions based on appearances and job titles, couldn't pretend that rank and training were the only measures of capability. The lesson had been taught, the education had been delivered, and Stevens knew it would follow him for the rest of his career, would make him question his assumptions, would make him look deeper, would make him recognize that the most important people in any operation were often the ones everyone else ignored. Clara Morrison had given him a gift, wrapped in humiliation and tied with shame, but a gift nonetheless. The gift of seeing clearly, the gift of understanding that strength didn't need to announce itself, that competence didn't require recognition, that legends walked among them in the most ordinary disguises imaginable. And sometimes, just sometimes, those legends got shoved to the floor by arrogant SEAL commanders who thought they knew what strength looked like. Stevens would never make that mistake again. What stays with you longer, the victory or the lesson? 3 months had passed since Hurricane Miranda. The warehouse at Naval Air Station Pensacola had been repaired, the damaged equipment replaced. The storm had moved into memory, joining the countless other disasters that shaped military operations and then faded into routine. But some things didn't fade. Some things lingered like scars you couldn't see but felt every day. Stevens stood in his quarters aboard the USS Hampton, a Lowe's Angels-class submarine operating in the Persian Gulf. His hands held a photograph he'd been staring at for the past 10 minutes. The image showed him receiving a commendation from Admiral Harrison, recognition for his role in disrupting Iranian submarine operations during emergency conditions. The official citation praised his leadership and tactical judgment. Stevens wanted to burn it, wanted to destroy the lie it represented, because his role had been standing there watching Clara Morrison work. His contribution had been staying out of the way while someone with actual expertise prevented a strategic disaster. The commendation was political necessity. Command structure maintaining the illusion that official hierarchies mattered more than individual capability. But he couldn't burn it, couldn't destroy it, because taped to the back of the frame was something else, something that mattered more than any official commendation. A note written in Clara's precise handwriting, 3 sentences that had been haunting him for 3 months. Leadership isn't always about being the smartest person in the room. Sometimes it's about recognizing who is. Learn that, and you'll become the officer you want to be. Stevens had read those words hundreds of times, had turned them over in his mind during long watches, had referenced them when making decisions about his team, had used them as a lens for evaluating his own behavior and choices. The video of him shoving Clara had never been posted. Mitchell had deleted it without being asked, had come to Stevens' quarters the day after the incident and shown him the deletion happening in real time. No explanation, no discussion, just the quiet acknowledgement that some things were too shameful to preserve. But Stevens didn't need the video. He remembered every detail. The sound of her clipboard hitting concrete, the scatter of pencils, the way she'd risen with such calm dignity, the way he'd felt powerful for exactly 30 seconds before his world started crumbling. His secure terminal chimed. Incoming message from Admiral Harrison. Stevens opened it with the mixture of anticipation and dread that came from knowing Harrison's communications usually meant complications. Stevens, Clara Morrison has been recalled to active duty for specialized operations in your theater. You will be receiving orders to provide logistical support for classified submarine interdiction operations. Consider this an opportunity to continue your education. Harris out. Stevens felt his chest tighten. Clara was coming here, to his theater, to waters where Iranian submarine activity had increased despite the disruption 3 months ago, where tensions were building toward something larger, something that required capabilities most officers didn't possess. He thought about their last conversation at Pensacola, after the Iranian submarines had withdrawn, after the congratulations and debriefs, after everyone else had left and it was just the two of them in that warehouse while Hurricane Miranda demolished the world outside. "Why did you let me treat you that way?" Stevens had asked. "Why didn't you stop me immediately?" Clara had been packing her equipment, moving with that same methodical precision she brought to everything, because sometimes people need to reveal who they are before they can understand what they need to change. If I'd pulled rank the moment you touched me, you would have been angry, resentful. You would have learned to hide your contempt but not eliminate it. This way, you learned something deeper. You learned what your arrogance costs, what your assumptions cost, and maybe, if you're smart, you'll carry that lesson forward. Stevens had understood she was right, had understood the gift she'd given him wrapped in humiliation. But understanding didn't make the shame easier to carry, didn't make the memory less painful. His team had changed since Pensacola. Mitchell had become quieter, more professional, less quick to mock people he perceived as inferior. Williams had started reading more, started questioning his assumptions about capability and expertise, started treating people with baseline respect regardless of their position or appearance. Jen had become obsessed with Clara's tracking methodology, had requested access to classified files detailing her operational history, had spent months studying her techniques, trying to understand how she extracted intelligence from data that looked like noise to everyone else. And Thompson, Master Chief Thompson, had transferred to Stevens' command specifically because of what had happened at Pensacola, had requested the assignment because he wanted to work with officers who were willing to learn, who were capable of recognizing when they were wrong and changing accordingly. Stevens looked around his small quarters, regulation perfect, everything in its place, reflecting the kind of controlled environment that came from people who needed external order because their internal landscape was messy. On his desk was another photograph, one he'd requested from Clara before she'd left Pensacola. The image showed her in different context, younger, maybe late 20s, standing on the deck of a submarine with a team of specialists. Her hair was shorter then, her face less lined, but her eyes showed the same calm competence, the same quiet strength. She'd signed the photograph, simple inscription. To Stevens, excellence doesn't need an audience, it just needs commitment, keep learning. CM. Stevens had studied that photograph more than any tactical manual, had examined the faces of the people standing with Clara, had researched their histories and discovered they were legends too. People whose operations had shaped modern naval warfare but whose names appeared nowhere in public records. People who worked in shadows and asked for no recognition beyond the satisfaction of work done properly. His terminal chimed again. Different notification this time. Encrypted message arriving through channels that required multiple authentication protocols. Stevens entered his codes and watched the message decrypt. Commander Stevens, Operational Briefing 600 hours. Submarine interdiction protocols with specialized contractor. Briefing location classified until 5:30 confirmation. Prepare your team for extended deployment. This operation requires judgment beyond standard training. Admiral Harrison. Specialized contractor. That was the designation for people like Clara. People whose official service had ended but whose capabilities were too valuable to ignore. People who existed in gray spaces between civilian and military, between retirement and active duty, between ordinary and extraordinary. Stevens stood and began preparing his dress uniform. The briefing would be formal, would involve people whose ranks exceeded his own, would involve Clara Morrison sitting at tables with admirals and discussing operations that existed at the intersection of technical mastery and strategic necessity. He thought about what he would say when he saw her, how he would acknowledge her presence without making it awkward, how he would demonstrate that he'd learned from their encounter without making it about his rehabilitation rather than her expertise. But mostly he thought about the lesson she'd taught him, the lesson that had been 3 months in the process of truly understanding. That strength didn't announce itself, that the most dangerous people were often the ones you never saw coming, that assumptions based on appearances and job titles were the fastest path to catastrophic failure. Stevens had been taught that lesson at Pensacola, had felt it burn through his arrogance like acid, had carried it with him through every decision and interaction since, and now he was getting another chance, another opportunity to demonstrate he'd actually learned something. The question was whether 3 months had been enough time for the lesson to truly take root, whether his transformation was real or just performance prompted by shame, whether he'd actually changed or just learned to hide his contempt more effectively. Clara would know. She'd see through any performance, would recognize whether his growth was genuine or just another kind of arrogance dressed in humility. Stevens adjusted his uniform, checked his appearance one final time, then headed toward the briefing that would determine whether he'd actually learned anything or just convinced himself he had. Outside his quarters, the Persian Gulf stretched toward horizons where Iranian submarines moved through darkness, where operations were being planned that would require capabilities most people didn't believe existed, where Clara Morrison was preparing to do work that would never be acknowledged but would shape the security of everyone who never knew her name. Stevens walked through the Hamptons' narrow corridors with growing understanding that his education wasn't complete, that what had happened at Pensacola was just the beginning, that Clara Morrison had more lessons to teach if he was willing to keep learning. The path ahead was unclear, but Stevens knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never again assume he understood what strength looked like, would never again dismiss someone based on their appearance or position, would never again let arrogance blind him to capabilities that operated outside his comprehension. Clara Morrison had taught him that lesson in the most painful way possible, and he was grateful, genuinely grateful, because the pain had been necessary. The humiliation had been educational, the shame had been transformative. Some teachers lectured, some demonstrated, some inspired. But the best teachers, the ones who changed you fundamentally, they held up a mirror and made you see yourself clearly, made you confront the ugliness, made you understand that transformation required more than just wanting to be better. It required seeing how far you'd fallen and choosing to climb back up. Stevens had seen himself clearly at Pensacola, had seen his cruelty, his arrogance, his willingness to hurt someone for no reason beyond making himself feel powerful. And now he was climbing, one decision at a time, one interaction at a time, one opportunity at a time to demonstrate that shame could become catalyst for genuine change. The briefing room was ahead. Beyond that door was Clara Morrison. Beyond that meeting was operations that would test everything he'd learned. Stevens took a deep breath, then pushed through the door into whatever came next, ready to learn, ready to listen, ready to recognize expertise even when it wore the most unexpected disguises. Because that was the lesson. That was what Clara Morrison had taught him at the cost of his pride and the price of his shame. Excellence walked among them every day, quiet, unassuming, waiting to be recognized by people wise enough to look deeper than surface appearances. Stevens was looking deeper now, and what he saw was the beginning of understanding what it meant to be not just competent, but truly professional, not just trained, but truly wise. The education continued, and this time Stevens was ready. When does a ghost become real again? The briefing room aboard the USS Hampton was stark. Metal walls, fluorescent lighting, a table surrounded by chairs where people with operational authority made decisions that shaped regional security. Stevens entered to find Admiral Harrison already present, along with Commander Chen from Intelligence, and several officers he recognized from classified operations briefings. And Clara Morrison, sitting at the table like she belonged there, because she did belong there, had always belonged there, even when she'd been wearing a logistics polo shirt and picking pencils off a warehouse floor. She looked different now. Her hair was pulled back in a professional style. She wore a contractor's uniform that suggested civilian status, but carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in military operations. Her black-rimmed glasses caught the overhead lighting. Her brown eyes met Stevens with calm acknowledgement. No hostility, no resentment, just recognition that they were here to work, that whatever had happened at Pensacola was past, that the only thing that mattered now was the mission. Commander Stevens, Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. Thank you for joining us. You know everyone here except possibly Ms. Morrison, though I understand you've worked together before. Stevens met Clara's eyes. Yes, sir, we've met. Something passed between them. Understanding that their previous encounter existed in shared memory but wouldn't be discussed, wouldn't be referenced, would remain private between people who'd learned difficult lessons and chosen to move forward. Harrison pulled up satellite imagery on the central display. The Persian Gulf shone in false color thermal, depth readings, current patterns, strategic choke points where submarine operations could affect global shipping. Ms. Morrison has been analyzing Iranian naval activity for the past 3 months. What she's discovered has significant implications for regional security. Clara stood and moved to the display. Her hands gestured across the imagery with practiced confidence. The submarines we disrupted at Pensacola were part of larger operational pattern. Over the past 18 months, Iranian naval forces have been positioning assets in ways that suggest preparation for sustained pressure on shipping lanes. Not attacks, not direct confrontation, but presence, psychological pressure, making commercial vessels uncertain about safety, making insurance companies nervous, affecting global trade through indirect means. Chen leaned forward, his analytical mind engaged. That's sophisticated strategic thinking, not just tactical harassment but economic warfare that operates below thresholds that would trigger military response. Exactly, Clara confirmed, and it requires capabilities we haven't seen from Iranian submarine forces before. New quieting technology, improved command and control, training that suggests advisory support from nations with more advanced submarine programs. Russia, Harrison said flatly, not a question, statement of fact. Clara nodded. Russian advisory teams have been working with Iranian naval forces since 2022. We have evidence of training exchanges, technology transfers, Operational coordination that goes beyond simple arms sales. They're building a submarine force that can affect regional security without engaging in direct combat. Stephen studied the imagery, seeing patterns Clara highlighted, understanding implications that 3 months ago he wouldn't have recognized. How do we disrupt this without triggering escalation? That's where Ms. Morrison's expertise becomes essential, Harrison said. She's developed tracking methodologies that allow us to monitor Iranian submarine operations while maintaining operational security, to know where they are without revealing how we know, to apply pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. Clara pulled up different displays, acoustic signature analysis, pattern recognition algorithms, methodologies that looked like art and science combined. Over the past 3 months, I've been building a comprehensive picture of Iranian submarine operations, identifying individual vessels by their acoustic signatures, tracking their training patterns, understanding their operational rhythms. This intelligence allows us to predict their movements, to position assets, to create uncertainty without direct confrontation. Stevens watched her work and felt the same awe he'd experienced at Pensacola. This was mastery. This was what decades of specialized experience produced. This was why legends existed. Because some people transcended normal capabilities through combination of talent and dedication and experience that couldn't be replicated through training alone. "What do you need from us?" Stevens asked. His voice was respectful, professional, the voice of someone who'd learned to recognize expertise and support it rather than compete with it. Clara looked at him directly. "I need submarine commanders who can operate in waters where Iranian vessels are present without engaging, who can maintain tracking protocols while appearing to conduct routine operations, who can recognize subtle indicators of submarine presence and respond appropriately, who can work with intelligence that comes from sources they can't discuss using methods they won't fully understand." Stevens nodded. "My crew can do that. We can be your eyes in waters where you can't operate directly." "Good," Clara said, "because over the next 6 months, we're going to build an intelligence picture that will allow regional command to make strategic decisions about Iranian naval capabilities. We're going to document their training patterns, their technology improvements, their coordination with Russian advisors, and we're going to do it quietly, without triggering escalation, without giving them reason to believe we're conducting active operations against their forces." Harrison stood. "This is delicate work, work that requires judgment beyond standard protocols, work that requires understanding nuance and restraint. Commander Stevens, I selected you for this operation because of what happened at Pensacola, not in spite of it, because of it." Stevens felt surprise register on his face. "Sir." Harrison's expression was serious, compassionate. "What happened at Pensacola revealed weaknesses in your judgment, arrogance that made you blind to capabilities you didn't recognize, but it also revealed something else. It revealed capacity for growth, for learning, for genuine transformation. You didn't make excuses, didn't blame circumstances. You acknowledged failure and committed to change. That's rare. That's valuable. That's exactly what this operation requires." Clara added quietly, "This work requires humility, requires recognizing that you don't know everything, that people with more expertise exist, that your job is to support operations you may not fully understand using judgment you've developed through experience. The fact that you learned that lesson the hard way makes you more qualified, not less." Stevens felt something shift in his chest, something that felt like forgiveness but came from himself rather than others, like permission to move forward without carrying shame as permanent burden. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Clara said simply, "because you understand what failure costs. You understand what arrogance costs. You understand that every interaction matters, that how you treat people reveals who you actually are beneath rank and training." The briefing continued for another hour. Technical specifications, operational timelines, coordination protocols, But Stephen's mind kept returning to Clara's words, to the understanding that his education at Pensacola had been painful but necessary, had been destructive but ultimately constructive, had torn him down so he could be rebuilt stronger. When the briefing ended, others filtered out. Clara remained, organizing her materials with that same methodical precision that characterized everything she did. Stevens approached carefully. "Clara." She looked up, her brown eyes calm behind her glasses. "Thank you," Stevens said simply, "for the lesson at Pensacola, for the opportunity now, for treating my failure as potential for growth rather than permanent stain." Clara smiled, tired but genuine. "We all fail, Commander, all of us. The question isn't whether you fail, it's what you do with the failure, whether you let it define you or refine you, whether you use it as excuse or as education." "You could have ended my career," Stevens said, "could have filed complaints, could have made sure I never recovered from what I did." "I could have," Clara agreed, "but that would have served no purpose except revenge. And revenge doesn't make anyone better. It just perpetuates cycles of hurt. I chose to believe you were capable of learning, capable of changing, capable of becoming the officer you wanted to be rather than the one you were in that moment." Stevens felt emotion tighten his throat. "I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to live up to that belief." "I know," Clara said, "I can see it. In how you treat your crew, in how you approach operations, in how you question your assumptions. The work shows, the growth shows, that's what matters." She picked up her materials and moved toward the door, then paused, looked back at Stevens with expression that carried weight of experience beyond his comprehension. "You know what I've learned in 30 years of this work? The most important quality isn't courage or skill or intelligence. It's humility, the willingness to admit you don't know everything, to learn from people you didn't expect to teach you, to recognize that excellence wears infinite disguises and your job is to see past the disguise to the truth beneath." Stevens nodded, unable to speak. "Keep learning, Commander. Keep questioning your assumptions. Keep recognizing that the most important people are often the ones everyone else ignores. Do that, and you'll have a career that matters, a legacy that extends beyond commendations and promotions, a life that actually changed things." She left. The door closed behind her with soft click. Stevens stood alone in the briefing room, surrounded by evidence of operations that would shape regional security through methods invisible to everyone except the people who made them possible. He thought about Clara's journey, from elite submarine hunter to logistics coordinator to recalled specialist, from Viper 7 to coffee lady to legend recognized again, from invisible to essential and back to invisible because that's how the work required her to be. He thought about his own journey, from arrogant SEAL commander to humiliated student to officer capable of recognizing expertise he didn't possess, from someone who found power in humiliating others to someone who found strength in supporting people whose capabilities exceeded his own. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be complete. Growth was process, not destination. Learning was journey, not achievement. Change was work you committed to daily, not accomplishment you achieved once and carried forever. But Stevens understood something now that he hadn't understood at Pensacola, understood it in his bones, in his conscience, in the part of himself that would carry Clara Morrison's lessons for the rest of his career. True strength didn't need audience, didn't need recognition, didn't need rank or title or official commendation. True strength looked exactly like Clara Morrison. Quiet, competent, unshakable, working in shadows, walking in plain sight while everyone looked past her, shaping outcomes while remaining invisible. And the most important skill for any leader wasn't tactical brilliance or strategic genius. It was recognition, the ability to see past appearances, to recognize capability beneath humble disguises, to understand that the most dangerous people were often the ones you never saw coming. Clara Morrison had taught him that lesson at the cost of his pride. had given him that gift wrapped in humiliation, had believed he was capable of learning even when he'd given her every reason to believe otherwise. Stevens would carry that lesson forward, would use it to become better, would honor her belief in him by actually transforming rather than just performing transformation. Because that's what excellence demanded, not perfection, not flawless execution, just honest commitment to growth, just willingness to see clearly, just courage to admit failure and choose differently next time. The Persian Gulf waited outside. Operations waited. Missions waited. Clara Morrison waited, ready to continue work that would never be acknowledged but would shape the world in ways invisible to everyone except the people who made them possible. And Stevens was ready, finally ready, not because he'd achieved perfection, not because he'd erased his failure, but because he'd learned the most important lesson anyone could learn. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and the strongest people in the world are the ones you never see coming until they've already changed everything. Clara Morrison had changed him, had transformed his failure into foundation for growth, had turned his shame into catalyst for genuine becoming. Now it was his turn to honor that gift, his turn to become the officer she'd believed he could be, his turn to look deeper, to recognize excellence, to support capabilities he didn't fully understand with judgment earned through painful education. The work waited, the mission waited, the opportunity to demonstrate that shame could become strength waited. Stevens walked through the Hamptons corridors with growing understanding that this was just beginning, that Clara Morrison's lessons would continue unfolding for years, that growth was process measured in decades, not moments. But he was committed now, truly committed, not to perfection, not to never failing again, but to learning from every failure, to seeing clearly, to recognizing that the most important people often wore the most humble disguises. Somewhere in the peaceful darkness of the Persian Gulf, former Chief Petty Officer Viper 7 moved through operations that would never appear in history books. But her influence would continue shaping naval operations through officers who'd learned to recognize and respect capabilities that transcended normal expectations. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained, carried forward by people who understood that true strength often wore the most humble disguise. And that sometimes, the most important lesson anyone could learn came from being shoved to the floor and choosing to rise with dignity intact.